Hi, we continue in Genesis 48 today and complete the chapter as Joseph seems to perceive as evil his father Jacob's putting his hands on what Joseph perceives as the wrong of his Egyptian children. So before we enter our passage, just to highlight where we are, if you can see on the right side of the screen, I've been going over since chapter 46 this order of events in these chapters, and if you haven't watched the introductory video for this unit, I encourage you to do so. Now we're at the end of this section on Ephraim and Manasseh here, and as we've been looking at, that's the key words in this section. If we scroll up to what we've seen, it's all about Ephraim and Manasseh in this chapter, after the previous chapter was all about the question of the land of Canaan versus the land of Egypt. So we saw last time this first round of these two parallel passages where Israel sees Joseph's sons and puts his hands on their heads and then is about to bless them and does bless them, and now we see Joseph's attempt to correct them and complete the chapter. And as we've been looking at, we've been seeing how this chapter 48 in many ways has echoes explicitly or implicitly of Jacob's journey throughout the book of Genesis and that of his ancestors as well. And we'll see this last one down here in our verses today, but there's also one more that we might see that I didn't put on there because it relies on a translation issue and the complex interrelationship of this passage with previous parts of Genesis, if we take it that way. We'll get there when we get there. And as we've been noting, and important now for the sake of seeing why it is, or perhaps why it is, that the father puts Ephraim over Manasseh, we can see here where Ephraim and Manasseh are throughout the Bible. And I note only in Numbers 8 is Ephraim referred to as the tribe, and Manasseh in Numbers 19. And otherwise it's the place, or in Hosea, the only prophet that is an extended riff on the name Ephraim. Ephraim is a name in Hosea's time for the contemporary people of Israel. Now, Hosea, almost certainly writing in the 8th century BCE, before any part of Genesis was written. So this would be the oldest part that we know of connected with Ephraim out of all these various texts here. Although perhaps 1 Samuel might even be older than that. Watch my series on the books of Samuel if you'd like to know that. But there it's not about tribes, it's simply about a place. And that's where it is most of these other places. And Manasseh, too, other than the fact that Manasseh in 2 Kings is mentioned 11 times as the bad king, that the Deuteronomic historian, who's the author of the entire collection of the historical narratives, ultimately from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, blames the exile on the sins of Manasseh. And so Manasseh, in the tradition, already whenever this scene we have in Genesis 48 was written, certainly exile or Persian period, or as I've been arguing, perhaps in the Ptolemaic period at the time of the Septuagint in the 3rd to 2nd century BC, after the Persian period. In any of those cases, this knowledge was before what we have here in Genesis 48. So that would be in the minds of the audience. And this is creating a backstory that Ephraim and Manasseh are children of Joseph, and that Jacob the father claimed they were his, as we saw in the beginning part of our scene up here. They are mine, shall be mine. And so that's what's at issue as we continue to go through here, and what Joseph's perception is of why he thinks something wrong has happened here. So let's just jump right in here on the left side in verse 17. So when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it more than displeased him. It was evil in his eyes. A very strong reaction, and we've seen it a couple of times here back in the Sodom story and a few others. I won't go through all the examples, but that's a very strong term. It's not just a preference. He thinks that's evil. And so he took his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And note the attitude about the relationship between Joseph and his father here. That Joseph is treating his father like he's either senile or otherwise incapacitated. We saw in the previous scenes that the narrator told us that Joseph's eyes, as you can see on the right side, are dim with age and he couldn't see well. But of course that says nothing about his capacity to think and to reason. And in fact, if anything, Sternberg suggested last time that there's a new literary element here for the first time in history, which is a blind person or an almost blind person being able to see clearly the future, be more clairvoyant, if you will, using Sternberg's language, than the apparent seeing people around him. So we already know that Jacob is not senile, but that's apparently what Joseph perceives, or at least that he has the power to correct his father's action, which would be highly dishonoring in the patriarchal culture of the time. But we've seen all the way back to the dreams in chapter 37 that Joseph basically did not honor his father, even though his father treated him like he was his favorite son. He had a dream and said it to them that they would all bow down to him, leading to his father being angry with him then. And as it happened, Joseph is the one who bowed down to Jacob, as we just saw in the previous scene. And so here's Joseph doing this, and we'll have to see what Jacob's response is in a moment. The term for remove here, lahasir, We saw back in chapter 30, relating both to the future fertility and wealth blessing, where Jacob was removing certain colored sheep and goats from the cattle that were Laban's. The son treats his father as if he was senile, as I mentioned. So he switches them around, and Joseph says to his father, not so. Lo Chen, using a strong term that we last saw in the discussion between Cain and Yahweh, back there, when Cain complained that the burden on him, his punishment, was too great, and Yahweh said, not so. So here's Joseph's explanation. Since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head. And I'd like to just pause for a moment to say, for anybody reading Genesis, that's got to be a humor line. Joseph doesn't perceive it that way, certainly, but would he not know the family history? Would he not have ever heard the story of how his father got the birthright and the blessing from his brother, from his parents, and stole it from his brother Esau? And certainly we've seen that the firstborn has never been favored throughout. Ishmael was the firstborn, and Isaac comes after, etc. So you'd think Joseph would certainly understand that in the whole history of their family here, but he apparently doesn't. Maybe he's been in Egypt too long and incorporated too much Egyptian theology and worldview into his head. It's certainly been a long time since he's been exposed to any traditions that come out of his family. But we see the response here. His father refused, and as Westerman notes below, expression is thus given to the conviction that in Israel, especially in the early period, although we have to consider what he means by the early period, certainly the text wasn't written in the early period, even though the story world is a relatively earlier period, as well as among many other peoples, a breadth of view and an insight into the future was attributed to the dying, which gave great importance to what they said before death. And that's certainly true, and we see it also with Moses and the book of Deuteronomy, and of course the New Testament, we see it with Jesus in texts like John 13-17, his Last Supper discourse. But his father refused here, and notice the root of the word is the opposite of amen. We can see amen here. The A is a vowel, it's not here, but the aleph there, the silent letter, is put in the middle of the word here and in the front of the word there, so it means the opposite. So amen means may it be so, and this is may it not be so. His father refused and said, this is Jacob, of course, speaking. Notice as his father, not either as Israel or Jacob. And he's the father here. And we see that here on the right side in the key words. Simply as father, not mentioned by name anywhere in this section until verse 21. He says, I know, my son, I know. An interesting doubling. That's not the kind of doubling we see where there are two verbs of the same kind in a row that are highlighting intensity. But here, my son is put in between them. So it is a doubling in a way, but not the way the usual Hebrew does. And it's the last of 57 times of yada, the word for to know in Genesis. And as we noted early on, to know in yada terms is to know intimately. It's interpersonal knowledge. It's not head knowledge that we would say data or information. It was the Adam knew his woman, and she bore a child. And so that's the kind of knowledge that's an issue in all of Genesis. And here it is now that Jacob has not sexual knowledge, of course, but intimate knowledge of the reality of their sons and their relationship with God and the relationship with the other peoples in what he's doing. And this is what we hear him say. He shall become a great people, and he shall also be great. And there's an interesting juxtaposition here of Im for people here and Goyim for nations around Ephraim. People is usually the honorific name that establishes the people of Yahweh. That Israel or Judah are Im, they're a people, whereas the others are Goyim. And in the New Testament, you hear that through the Latin as Gentiles, the basic Israelite perspective of othering people who are not themselves and described as nations, translating Goyim. But here it has that Manasseh, the one that's less favored, will become what is the more favored term, people, and be great. And it's Ephraim who's the more favored, who becomes a multitude of nations. And when we look at, the echo here, we see this is, of course, echoing the oracle that Rebekah got in chapter 25 about the elder shall serve the younger. Here, there's no expression of the relationship between them in terms of serving, one serving the other, but just the relative greatness of them. So Manasseh shall also be great, but nevertheless his younger brother, and that's the connection with 25:23, shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. Or literally a fullness of nations. Mellow, it means a fullness. And that connects us explicitly with Deuteronomy 33:16, which we'll see next time when we look at Genesis 49, is an entirely parallel set of blessings, or at least statements about the eponymous tribal ancestors through the voice of Moses. And certainly Deuteronomy 33 written before Genesis 49, even though in the sequence we have in the Bible, Deuteronomy is obviously much later. But Deuteronomy, by almost all measures, from the time of Josiah in the 7th century BCE, perhaps 630s and 620s, before the exile, and all of Genesis being after the exile, and this part perhaps much later. So let's look briefly at Deuteronomy 33:16, and next time we'll look at the two chapters together. So here, this is part of the blessing on Joseph, as you can see in the verse, with the choice gifts of the earth and its fullness, and the favor of the one who dwells on Sinai, of course echoing an Exodus tradition that we don't know in Genesis, but is fitting the Deuteronomistic context there. So scholars have noted the parallels there, and we'll look at that next time, even though this verse here in Genesis 48:19 is apart from what we'll see in chapter 49, as you can see already on our screen down below. So what multitude of nations or fullness of nations will Ephraim become? It's an interesting question, because throughout the rest of the Bible, again, mostly written before our current passage, Ephraim is either simply a land and not a people at all, it's any kind of polity, or a name for Israel after the Assyrian conquest, especially then, or sometimes earlier, but then it becomes a synonym with Samaria, the capital city, as well. So we really don't know what multitude of nations might be said to come from Israel. Put a comment in the note if you got a comment under the video and here on YouTube if you have a thought yourself. So he blessed them that day. Why that day? The day isn't any particular day, we don't know, but certainly highlighting the concrete nature of it. And as I've been noting throughout this unit, and especially in recollection of Genesis 27, the fight between the children and between the parents, if you will, for Jacob to get the fatherly blessing, that the fatherly blessing has no actual power to produce blessing. That blessing in the Bible, all the way from the beginning, is a matter of fertility. Fertility of the land, fertility of the human body to produce abundance and all that one needs. And humans obviously aren't capable of increasing the amount of abundance of the earth or of people. Only God is the master of fertility as the creator. So this is merely a wish for what would happen, not something that actually has power. And here's what he has to say. By you, Israel, and this is the second time we're hearing it as a historical people. We saw it once earlier when it was connected with a plural pronoun, they, and now we hear it this way. And this is perhaps why the father is not referred to as Israel or even as Jacob until after this, as we see in the next verse. And that's also suggesting to people like Westerman that these verses are from some other source, but we don't have to take that route, and we'll see that in just a minute. So, by you, Israel will invoke blessings, or as Westerman suggests, in you will Israel bless itself with these words. But the verb barak, to bless, and the PL implying blessings from God. So it's not a matter of bless itself so much as Westerman suggests, but that by them, notice it's by you, plural here, the two of them together, even though we'll see the narrator say he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Is it simply referring to the younger one? Well, it's a you plural, so it applies to both of them. So out of Ephraim and Manasseh, there will become abundance from God, saying, God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh, like those are symbols of a source of divine blessing. Although, again, the historical text that happened before that did not necessarily pair up with that. So the narrator concludes, he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh, or more literally, as you can see from my note below, put Ephraim in the face of Manasseh, or as I translated over here, ahead of the face. And we can, I changed it back before I posted this again, so it parallels here. Ephraim in the face of Manasseh, which is not to say confronting in that sense, but in line ahead of him, so to speak. And so that concludes the Ephraim-Manasseh part. But now Israel says to Joseph, referred to as Israel. And given that we just saw Israel as a nation, perhaps we can hear this as the nation of Israel saying to Joseph as well as the father. And we get to chapter 49, we'll see how a number of scholars see the Joseph and Judah relationship as an expression of Israel and Judah's relationship in the exilic period. We'll get to that next time. So perhaps there's some of that already leaking into the end of chapter 48 here. So, as Westerman consistently says, independent sayings of Jacob appended to the end of the story, but not necessary at all to see it. But what he adds here is helpful. He sees it announcing the return from Egypt, quote, understood as a theological clamp, which is meant to bind the leading out of Egypt and Exodus Numbers more firmly with the story of the patriarchs. And then he adds we can only understand verse 21 together with 50:24, which is another statement of Joseph about to die, Jacob about to die, but we'll look at that when we get there. So Israel says to Joseph, I'm about to die, but God will be with you. Notice throughout it's not Yahweh. This is apparently going along with the theology at the end of not only Joseph's story, but the end of throughout the entire Joseph story, that Yahweh is not the specific God name, but the generic Elohim. Elohim will be with you and bring you again to the land of your ancestors. And we just need to highlight how important that is for the voice of Israel saying Egypt is not our home. Despite Joseph saying that God has led you here and I'm the one who's giving you relief here, their home is in Canaan. And Jacob insisted that his bones, when he dies in Egypt, be brought back. And now he's making clear in this blessing that God will bring them back to the land of your fathers. And so Egypt is only this temporary place, unfortunately for them, a place of long-standing slavery, already, of course, known to the audience. To the extent we read this as an exilic story, as I'll note next time, we could hear that as coming out of Babylon. But as we'll see next time, why refer to Babylon when the story refers explicitly to Egypt that's relevant to various contexts. So now the last verse, and at one level this seems completely out of context, and Westerman says it again, an isolated tradition quite foreign to the context, but yet again completely unnecessary. And we can, if we look at portion here, we can see where Mark Brett's view understands this very differently. The word for portion here is Shechem, which also means shoulder. So we saw it as a city in chapter 34, of course, spelled slightly differently, so it's not listed here under that. But Brett notes that, and I'll note at the next reading here, that the next use of portion, which isn't in the Hebrew, that implying that this refers to Shechem in Genesis 34. Let's look to it here and see what he has to say. He says, quote, "The problems of 49:7, which we'll see next time, are best accounted for by the hypothesis that the editors here are being deliberately ironic. There is only one tradition of violent conquest of Shechem, and this is precisely the tradition in Genesis 34. Jacob's attitude to that violence is indicated in his final testament in the indictment against Simeon and Levi, which is in 49:7. The gift of Shechem, which is being referred to here, I now give you one Shechem, reflects the historical fact that this was indeed the territory of Joseph, but the idea that the city was taken by Jacob's violent conquest simply draws attention to the oddness of the notion within the otherwise erratic context of Genesis. Compare that to Ferber's argument for a double tradition of Shechem conquest, stories that have been redacted in the present text here and in Judges 9. But I'm much more a believer here in Brett's view of the situation. So if we go back to the first use of portion in the New RSV here, where the word Shechem is, we can see that the Joseph Shechem, recalling Genesis 34, implying the Joseph tribes will get the land of Shechem. And we can see that explicitly. So if we go back to Joshua 17, we can see here allotments were made to the rest of the tribe of Manasseh, including Shechem. These were their male descendants of Manasseh, son of Joseph, by their families. And so we can see there was already a tradition in Joshua that Shechem was a part of the land of Manasseh and of the people of Joseph. And so there's no reason to think of this as an isolated element. It's connected both to Manasseh and to earlier in Genesis. And from that perspective, we might put one more link at the bottom of this, recalling Genesis 34, which I didn't do there. So let's continue to hear what sense this makes out of it. I will give you one Shechem more than your brothers. One Shechem? There's only one Shechem. There's only one place of Shechem as far as we know. So the one isn't clear. The one that I took from the hand of the Amorites. And we only see Amorites a few times earlier. At one level, it's a generic name for the Canaanites, but at another level, it's a specific group, although we know very little about them. We can see them referred to. At the time, the Shechemites were not Amorites. They're referred to as Shechemites later because of the name Shechem. But they didn't necessarily have a name of people there. It's certainly not Amorites. So we don't know why that there. And with my sword and my bow, takes away from the Genesis 34 note that it was Simeon and Levi who used their swords, etc., to kill all the Shechemites. But as we'll see when we get to 49, not only, as we can see down below already, Simeon and Levi, weapons of violence are their swords, making clear that his sword here, Israel Jacob's sword, is really the sword of his sons that he's noting there. So he's connecting this with the traditions that we already have in Joshua, that the city of Shechem will become part of the land of Manasseh. And that completes our chapter. And as we'll see next time, chapter 49 and 50 establish relationships among the tribes that not only allow them to see themselves as a unit, but highlight some of the future history the Genesis authors already know that points toward an expected Messiah. We'll begin to see that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.